We'll move on to the next speaker, who is Professor Athena Aktipis from the University of Arizona, who is going to be teaching us about how to survive the apocalypse, apparently. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Arizona State University. They're often confused, but ASU is in Tempe and University of Arizona is in Tucson. So anyway, we've been talking today about some pretty heavy topics, right? Misinformation and democracy. So we're going to lighten things up a little bit and talk about, of course, the apocalypse. And we'll start with a good question to kind of start your morning, which is, what do you need to survive the apocalypse? Now, if you're like most people, you might be thinking, maybe I should have a go bag or a shelter in place kit with some of these items. That might help me survive in the apocalypse. But actually, most important survival tool that we have is our brains. And not just our brains, but also the social environment that we're in, our apocalypse team. And so today I'm going to talk to you about how we're actually a little bit more apocalypse hardy than we think, even without, go bags filled with stuff and shelter in place kits and preps and all of that. Because we actually evolved in a world where apocalyptic events were happening, often in people's lifetimes, multiple ones, and our brains evolved to deal with risk, even apocalyptic and catastrophic risk. So I'll talk to you guys about how in small scale societies, people manage risk and the various strategies that people use and how that can potentially help us all to deal with crises and challenges, even if they aren't full on apocalypses. So I have a good message though to get you started with, which is you are actually an apocalypse hardy human. Charles Darwin, he might not have exactly said this, but certainly if we look at our evolutionary history and small scale societies as a sort of example of what our historical evolutionary trajectory was like, dealing with catastrophes is something we've been doing for a very long time. Tell you just a little bit about myself. I am a professor at ASU, and I also am a podcaster and an author. And so I work on many different questions around cooperation. That's kind of my main focus, how we can scale up cooperation from smaller systems to larger ones, whether we're talking about human societies and going from small scale interactions to global ones, or we're talking about cellular interactions. So how the cells in our body interact at very large, up to very large scales, right? We're about 30 trillion cells that are cooperating and coordinating every millisecond, kind of astounding. And a lot of the same principles apply across these scales. So that's a little bit about sort of my broad background and research approach. I'll be talking about some of our work in the Human Generosity Project, where we've used various methods to look at human cooperation and in particular risk management during catastrophes. And also, I wanted to mention we're starting a new network. We have started, actually, we're expanding it now, Cooperation Science Network. So if you are interested in doing cooperation research from an interdisciplinary perspective, please join us. And also, because I couldn't leave out the zombie side of things, I not just work on catastrophes and apocalypses, but also zombies. So all of what you were hearing earlier in the last two talks about misinformation actually fits very nicely within this framework of kind of considering what zombification means today, and how our brains can be hijacked by intentions that might not really come from inside of us. So if all of these topics are interesting to you, then do check these out. Okay, but let's get to the apocalypse. So we know that the frequency and severity of disasters is increasing. So it's a concern now thinking about how can we deal with these challenges that we're facing. But as I pointed out earlier, the apocalypse is not new. And when I'm saying the apocalypse here, really, I mean catastrophe is including, but not limited to, infectious diseases, famines, environmental changes that can also, cause climate issues and severe weather events, wars, many other sources of catastrophic risk. These have been things that humans have been facing for our entire evolutionary history. And so effectively managing risk is actually a key adaptive problem that we as humans have had to solve for our entire existence as humans, and even before that. So then we can ask the question, what cognitive capacities and decision rules did our ancestors use to survive? And of course, we can't go back in time and look at our ancestors specifically, but we can look at small scale societies that are living in subsistence conditions. We can look at hunter-gatherers and pastoralists and see how they are managing risk. And then we can take that information and do computer modeling as well as experiments in the lab to look at how, see it, whether those decision rules actually are evolutionarily viable with models, and also if they seem to be what people are actually doing in the lab when we give them the opportunity. So let's start with the Maasai. So the Maasai are East African pastoralists, and they live in the Great Rift Valley. Their ecology is variable. So people who live on the mountaintop are going to have different conditions than the people who live in the valley. And the Maasai have herds that they are sustained by, at least traditionally. That's how works among the Maasai. They consume the milk, blood, and meat, and their herd growth will vary. Sometimes there's drought or disease, and theft is also a possibility. So they're trying to, manage their source of their livelihood in this challenging environment. Now, they have a sharing system called Osotwa, which is characterized by the two very simple rules: ask only if you're in genuine need, and give if you're asked and able. And Osotwa actually means umbilical cord. So it has a sort of metaphor built into it of an individual helping their offspring, which we know, evolutionarily speaking, is a very powerful force. There's been a lot of selection on humans to invest in their offspring. So the fact that this metaphor is being used, it really kind of grounds this in like a genuine care for the well-being of others. One thing that's important to note about Osotwa is that there's no expectation of return. So it's not like traditional reciprocity or account keeping. And in fact, the Maasai have a separate system called Sile, which is a debt-based transfer system. So this system is characterized by debt. And that also tells us that this Osotwa system is definitely not, because they have two separate systems for it. So we created a model to look at how this need-based transfer rule would perform in ecological conditions that map onto the Maasai. And what we found was that we had higher survival and greater correlation of outcomes between the partners with Osotwa. Then I added in debt-based transfer rules to compare those with the need-based transfer rules. And in these situations, the agents were keeping track of what their previous partner gave them and paying them back if they could. And what found here is that the need-based transfer rules did better than the debt-based transfer rules, but debt-based transfer rules did better than no transfers. So debt-based systems give some measure of pooling of risk and some, help with survival, but not as good as the need-based rules. We also found that the need-based transfers give you more wealth equality than the debt-based transfers or situations with no transfers. And then finally, for those of you who are familiar with sort of game theoretic approaches, you might be wondering, well, what happens when a need-based player plays against or with, you could say, a debt-based player in this case? And what's interesting is this maps onto a coordination game, also known as a stag hunt, where two players using a need-based strategy do better than two players using a debt-based strategy. But it's in order to move from a debt-based strategy to a need-based strategy, both players have to agree or know that the other player is going to move to the need-based strategy, because the player that first makes a transition to the need-based strategy would do worse than they would if they were playing the debt-based strategy with another debt-based playing agent. So to me, this suggests that there's an importance in sort of coordinating about what system you're in, and that might be part of why, like among the Maasai, you have lots of cultural norms around osotwa and lots of sort of explicit discussion about that. So if we kind of break it down, need-based transfers, you have basically these three steps. First, there's a request to fill a need, and that request is limited to the amount that's needed. And then you have a response from the partner, and that response is limited to what that partner can give without going below their own threshold. So this is a limited risk pooling system. It's different from like a resource pooling system. It's not like everyone's putting everything into the common pot and sharing it equally. They're just agreeing to take on some portion of the other party's risk, but not the full risk, and not so much that they would go below what they need. So we've seen these kinds of systems across lots of societies, with the Maasai, Osotwa, in Fiji, a system called Keri among the Hadza and other hunter-gatherers. Central place food sharing is common. In the desert Southwest, there's a system called neighboring, which has many of these same characteristics. The Ik in Uganda have a system called Tamora Marang. So these need-based transfer systems are something that we see across many societies. And these systems can help limit losses in catastrophic conditions. And they're actually really well designed exactly for these kinds of unexpected, unpredictable kinds of problems that can occur. And if we kind of back up a little bit now to think about risk management, we as humans manage many risks socially. Now, the need-based transfers that I talked about and risk pooling, that's a form of risk transfer where individuals are sharing resources under certain conditions. But humans will also retain risk. So they'll, stockpile things. That's something you can do on your own. You can also avoid risk on your own. You can reduce risk on your own. But if you do these things socially, you can potentially do them more effectively. Risk transfer, though, is the only one that you absolutely need other humans in order to do, or some other entity that's going to share your risk. And if we look across the societies in the Human Generosity Project, we see that most of the social risk management that's going on is actually this risk transfer, risk pooling, need-based transfer kind of risk management. One of the societies that we looked at, the Darhad in Mongolia, they actually provide assistance before disasters because they deal with these huge, horrible winter storms, and they can't actively help each other during those storms because they can't get to each other. But other than that, most of the social risk management involves need-based transfers. Then we can ask, well, do need-based transfers exist outside of small-scale societies? And my former graduate student, Jessica Ayers, who's now starting a position at Boise, she did a study of expectations about friendship and basically asked people, what rules do you expect your friends to follow? And we were really struck by this, the extreme importance really of this helps me when I'm in need compared to many of the other priorities that people might have for their friends. And in fact, paying back is all the way at the bottom here. So I think there may be something about how we think about friendship that does map onto these need-based transfer relationships. I mentioned earlier that we have a study site in the desert Southwest. These are with modern ranchers. And this allowed us to look at another thing that we are interested in, which is how unpredictability affects people's expectations of being repaid. So this is based on field work that we did and then a large demographic survey where we asked people about giving help to other ranches and receiving help, and then how predictable the type of work or the type of help or the need for help was. And so what we found was quite clear, actually, that the more predictable the need is, the the less people were likely to expect to be repaid in these communities. So if people were helping each other because of illness or death or injuries, they did not expect to be repaid for that help. We also have done some studies in the lab, including one where people played a resource management game, and then they read different framings, one that was an Osotwa frame, one that was a rancher frame, and one that was that had no frame. And participants were able to ask for help or give help to their partners. And essentially what we found was both the need-based transfer frames, the Osotwa and the rancher frames, led to more giving, larger requests, more unconditional giving, more unconditional asking, and less matching of the amounts that were given and received. So this suggests that this need-based transfer behavior can really be elicited by social and cultural information, which is interesting also if you think about it in the context of the sort of need to coordinate that one is doing a need-based transfer kind of interaction. So I'm going to go ahead and close up here and just say that, if we want to try to scale up for larger networks, we can look to some societies like the Fijians, where they've done this, where they actually have relationships among villages, not just among each other. And I think these need-based transfer systems can provide potentially decentralized insurance where markets can't, because you don't require actuarial data, and they can function well in the face of uncertainty. In fact, they're designed for it. Humans spontaneously help one another in these kinds of situations, so it's a very natural thing. And also you can begin these relationships just with dyads, so you don't have to fully shift to new norms in order to make them happen. And with that, I would like to thank everybody who has been a part of this, especially my illustrator, Neil Smith, who's down here at the bottom. And also want to invite you all, if you're interested in this kind of approach to interdisciplinarily looking at how we can deal with the apocalypse and also the dynamics of zombification, join us at ZAM 2020 in October.
Great, thank you. We have time for one or two questions. I'll start off if no one is jumping at things. And it's actually maybe anticipating just the very end of your talk, which is, this is all very positive. The thing I kept wondering about is how these scales from small-scale societies, especially ones where it seems to me that this need-based transfer system probably requires either an element of trust or an element of in-groupness, that doesn't seem to describe, say, all aspects of American society. Even like the ranchers, it's among other ranchers and so forth. So do you think this is scalable in a place like, say, America or some large country that's actually driven by a lot of polarization and factionalism?
So that's a great question. And there's two answers. So one is, yes, potentially, we do need to have some sense of sort of being in this together, of being interdependent, of being on the same team in one way or another to develop these effective need-based transfer systems. But I think there's also some possibilities for developing hybrid systems that incorporate aspects of need-based transfers and aspects of markets. So one of my favorite examples is the seat transfer system in airlines. So if you've ever been rerouted because of a storm or equipment failure on a major airline, you have participated in this seat transfer system. So essentially, airlines have contracts with each other where they will sell seats at below market prices, basically at cost to each other, when the airlines are encountering needs that are unpredictable because of these forces that are beyond their control. And so this is just one example of where you can embed these need-based transfer principles within a market. There's also other examples like banking systems where banks would lend funds at lower rates when there was a need. And so when we sort of think about like how can we design broader global systems to manage risk, figuring out, well, when does it make sense to use market-based principles versus when does it make sense to use need-based principles that really have to do with sort of insuring against catastrophic and unpredictable losses. I think we can potentially come from both sides, from the sort of top down with these kinds of hybrid systems, and then from the bottom up with building stronger communities and really making space for people to develop the kinds of relationships among each other that you do need to have effective need-based transfer systems that don't have contracts underlying them and things like that.
Great. That's weirdly promising. Thank you. I don't see any more questions, and we're about out of time anyway. So actually, yeah, we have one if you can be quick, do you think?
Absolutely.
Sure, that can be quick. Thank you so much for your talk. This is very interesting and very relevant. I'm really interested in cultural transmission of knowledge, and what you seem to be describing was this social infrastructure across a present generation. And I guess I thought if you've thought about this for intergenerational infrastructure. So we have lullabies that describe disease symptoms, or I've also heard about folk songs that describe tsunami warnings. And I guess I wonder, would you predict that as we scale up in society, you were talking about in-group and out-group things as we have this breakdown, might you predict that this intergenerational knowledge that's passed on might also have a breakdown in large-scale communities?
That's a great point. And in fact, Osotwa, which I started with, the need-based transfer system that the Maasai use, is very much based on the sort of intergenerational transmission of these norms. And in fact, Osotwa itself can be passed down in families, is passed down in families. So you will inherit the Osotwa relationships that your parents have, as well as all this sort of cultural knowledge. And the fact that, we see these need-based transfer systems across societies, and we see them as these sort of intergenerational cultural elements, I think really underlines your first point. Now, formal descriptions of need-based transfer relationships in modern Western, very mobile market society, because the norms around transfers, people are often sort of assuming that there's market-based norms underlying them, even when there's not. And not just sort of assume that they're based on market principles, because oftentimes they're not. And maybe we can revive some of these norms, or develop sort of ways of talking about and thinking about those that work in our more large scale society. And the thing that I also just want to come back to is, you only need a dyad. You only need two people to agree that you're in a need-based transfer relationship for it to work. And then that network can go from there. And it doesn't necessarily just have to include people who are in an in-group. It doesn't necessarily just have to include people who are from, the same background as you. It's something that, can grow organically, sort of based on those dyadic relationships. So I think that that's, one piece of this that is definitely something that is empowering for all of us, and optimistic, because it's in our own hands to create those relationships that can help us all manage risk better.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I'm going to have to turn over now to our final speaker.